the New Deal, 1933 through 1939. At the end of the study of this unit, the American history student should have an understanding of the following. What were the accomplishments and criticisms of the first New Deal? 2. Analyze why FDR launched his second New Deal in 1935. How did it differ from the first? 3. What was the purpose and structure of the Social Security system? And 4. How did the New Deal transform the role of federal government in American life? Roosevelt's New Deal. Before we get into his New Deal, we need to know a little bit of the background of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, known as FDR, and his wife Eleanor Roosevelt. Both were born to wealthy parents whose families were among America's social aristocracy. FDR was elected to the New York Senate in 1910 and appointed by President Wilson as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1913. At 39 years of age, FDR contracted polio, leading to an ongoing physical disabilities and pain that many say made him more focused and empathetic toward others who faced hard circumstances. These characteristics helped make him an even better politician who would charm and manipulate his audience. FDR also generally liked people and enjoyed talking with them. He is willing to experiment as he worked with others to define what exactly he had promised America in his New Deal. Majority of Americans never knew that he was in a wheelchair. The 1933 Inaugural. Lame duck. No additional legislation to provide relief was passed by the old conservative Congress or the newly elected Congress, who preferred to wait for the new man. The 20th Amendment was ratified on February 6, 1933. It moved inauguration from March 4th to January 20th. It reconvened Congress on January 3rd and designated that the Vice President-elect would become president if the president-elect were to be disabled before taking office. FDR's election in 1932 was the last time that 4 months would pass between a president's election and an inauguration. The 21st Amendment, because FDR won such a landslide campaigning on the repeal of Prohibition, Congress submitted to the states the 21st Amendment on February 20th, 1933, and it became law on December 3rd, 1933, when the 36th state, Utah, ratified it. In the inaugural address, FDR gave a very uplifting speech in which he said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." The first 100 days. Roosevelt would start his administration on what he's going to accomplish in his first 100 days. Since then, he set a precedent in which presidents or people running for president will explain to the American people what they hope to accomplish in the first 100 days. None of them, since Roosevelt, has been able to accomplish so much as he did in his first 100 days. The three major challenges that awaited FDR when he arrived in the White House was reviving the economy, relieving human misery, and rescuing farms and farmers. A three-pronged strategy was introduced. Banks would be propped up, the industrial complex would be the recipient of federal funds to keep it afloat, and farm commodity prices would be raised. He did this through a series of fireside chats, preparing to deliver his first of his popular fireside chats, and we've seen the photograph there, to the national radio audience. FDR used clear, simple language to get his message across. First order, to get people to put money in the bank. This message focused on the measures to reform the American banking system. With no blueprint of what to concerning the growing economic crisis, he did not know for certain what would or would not work. He had tried many innovative things while governor of New York. He manifested a flexible, pragmatic approach to meet the economic crisis. Therefore, he brought with him specialists, professors, journalists, economists, social workers, and others to advise him. 15 pieces of legislation were passed in the first 100 days, from March 9, 1933 to June 16th. Shoring up the financial system. A vigorous Roosevelt drives Congress to action in this Detroit News cartoon from March 1933. FDR persuaded Congress to declare a 4-day bank holiday to allow the banking panic to subside. Along with the Emergency Banking Relief Act, FDR allowed banks to reopen only once they were able to prove that they were sound. FDR controversially took the United States off the gold standard. This allowed him to increase the currency supply and avoid deflation. Initially, many bankers and economists were shocked by this move, but by 1936, most of the nations of the world had followed this model. The Glass-Steagall Banking Act of 1933 created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC. And this begins the alphabet programs, as sometimes they're called, which insured customer bank accounts up to $2,500. The account also gave the Federal Reserve Board more authority to become involved in financial emergencies and more heavily regulating the interactions between banks and the stock market. Regulating Wall Street. The Securities Act of 1933. It required the federal government to register and approve all issues of stocks and bonds and issues to make full disclosure all pertinent information about an issuing company to eliminate fraud. The Securities Exchange Act of 1934 established the Securities and Exchange Commission, which had the power to enforce the new regulatory laws and regulations, things such as making stock pools illegal, for example. The first chairman of the SEC was Joseph Kennedy. When FDR announced this to his brain trust, he was told, "Mr. President, Kennedy's a crook." FDR replied, "Well, it takes a crook to catch one." The federal budget. FDR sought to reorganize federal agencies, lower payments to military veterans who had non-service related disabilities, and reduce government worker salaries as part of his efforts to reduce the federal government spending. Helping the unemployed and homeless. As opposed to Hoover, who had opposed any direct federal assistance to the needy, FDR bypassed the states to directly aid those in need. When plans to provide money to the states through the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA. FERA had appropriated $500 million for quick relief, with half given immediately as direct relief. It matched $1 for every $3 to states with their own relief programs. Harry Hopkins was appointed as the Federal Relief Administrator. The Civil Works Administration. FDR bypassed them through the Civil Works Administration, which provided jobs while funding infrastructure and teaching jobs across the nation. Some 4 million were employed raking leaves, shoveling snow, and working in national parks, which critics again complained was make work. The high cost of the program caused it to end in 1934. However, the 4 million people who had never been employed by the agency were unemployed again. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, enrolled 250,000 young men. Directed by Army officers and foresters, the CCC camps were operated like military bases. The CCC was created to provide jobs for unmarried males ages 18 to 25. Projects included reforestation, road construction, soil erosion, and flood control, and the development of national parks, although critics again claimed that this was make work. Thus, the alphabet agencies in the New Deal were being formed by paying people once they completed jobs instead of paying the unemployed. FDR hoped to prevent a generation of idlers on the government dole, at $30 a month, as much as $25 being sent home. The program was discontinued at the end of 1941, when American boys were needed to plant Nazis and Japanese into the ground instead of trees. 2.5 million men would work in 1,500 CCC camps, although the majority of these camps were located in the South. Due to segregation laws, no African American young males were allowed to join. The Homeowners Loan Corporation allowed people who were at risk of losing their homes to refinance their mortgage at lower interest rates. The 1934 Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which is still in place today, offered 20-year mortgages which replaced monthly payments by doubling the typical term of mortgages. The National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, was designed to balance the interests of business and labor and consumers and to reduce unemployment. For codes of fair competition, antitrust laws were suspended. Section 7A guaranteed workers the right to collective bargaining. It also established minimum wage and maximum hour laws. Hugh S. Johnson directed the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, whose symbol was the Blue Eagle, and the motto is, "We do our part." It also established the Public Works Administration, the PWA, which supervised the building of roads, public buildings, and other projects, funded with $3.3 billion. Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, was appointed director. Among the projects were the Grand Coulee Dam, New York's Triborough Bridge, and almost 3/4 of the nation's new schools. Agricultural assistance. After World War I, when government subsidies to plant more were discontinued, the farmers found themselves in debt and with a surplus of crops. The overproduction of land and then the rapid decline in prices forced many farmers to neglect their fields. The Agricultural Adjustment Act in 1933 was designed to restore purchasing power of agricultural products by cutting production and limiting surplus crops of basic commodities and establishing parity prices. It also established the subsidy principle whereby the voluntary reduction of acreage in production, farmers were paid direct benefits or rental payments. It authorized the president to inflate the currency by devaluing its gold content or the free coinage of silver and issuing $3 billion in paper currency. So in other words, farmers were paid not to plant. The Farm Credit Act of June 16, 1933 also provided funds for loans for farmers to meet their mortgage payments. Payments to these programs could come from a production tax on the processors of certain farm commodities, the middleman. Dust Bowl migrants. A decade-long drought in the 1930s spawned a human and environmental catastrophe known as the Dust Bowl. It affected the Great Plains region of the United States, encompassing Colorado, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska. Tilled land left by farmers who could not afford to plant, coupled with the drought and the high winds of the regions, resulted in what were called the Black Blizzards. By 1938, 25 million acres of prime farmland had lost most of its topsoil. Farmers in this area would migrate to the cities to find employment, or would rarely find jobs. When the drought and dust storms showed no signs of relenting, many people headed west towards California, and the last thing that they owned, their automobile. They were called Okies and Arkies, and would end up working as migrant farmers in California, displacing Mexican immigrants. It would not be until the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act was added that attempts to contain the Dust Bowl were initiated, cut back production on wheat and cotton. The Tennessee Valley Authority was created, and all government-owned property at Muscle Shoals was transferred to the authority, governed by a three-man board. The authority was charged with building dams, generating and selling electricity, manufacturing and selling fertilizers produced, establishing flood control, and developing navigation. 6 dams were completed before World War II. Critics charged it was unfair competition with private companies supplying electricity in the area in the states of Tennessee, North Carolina, Kentucky, Virginia, Mississippi, and Georgia. Unfortunately, it was the only such project developed. Eleanor Roosevelt was a shy, awkward child starved for recognition and love. Eleanor Roosevelt grew into a woman with great sensitivity to the underprivileged of all creeds, races, and nations. Her constant work to improve their lot made her one of the most loved and for some years one of the most reviled women of her generation. She was born in New York City on October 11, 1884, daughter of the lovely Anna Hall and Elliot Roosevelt, younger brother of Theodore. When her mother died in 1892, the children went to live with Grandmother Hall. Her adored father died only 2 years later. Attending a distinguished school in England gave her at 15 her first chance to develop self-confidence among other girls. Tall, slender, graceful figure, but apprehensive at the thought of being a wallflower. She returned for a debut that she dreaded. In her circle of friends was a distant cousin, handsome young Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They became engaged in 1903 and were married in 1905, with her uncle, the President Theodore Roosevelt, giving the bride away. With 11 years, Eleanor bore 6 children. One son died in infancy. I suppose I was fitting pretty well into the pattern of fairly conventional, quiet young society matron, she wrote later in her autobiography. Political helpmate. In Albany, where Franklin served in the state senate from 1910 to 1913, Eleanor started her long career as political helpmate. She gained a knowledge of Washington and its ways while he served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. When he was stricken with polio in 1921, she tended him devotedly. She became active in the Women's Division of the State Democratic Committee to keep his interest in politics alive. From a successful campaign for governor in 1928 to the day of his death, she dedicated her life to his purpose. She became the eyes and ears for him, a trusted and tireless reporter. When Mrs. Roosevelt came to the White House in 1933, she understood that social conditions better than any of her predecessors, and she transformed the role of First Lady accordingly. She never shrinked from official entertaining. She greeted thousands with charming friendliness. She also broke precedent to hold press conferences, travel to all parts of the country, give lectures and radio broadcasts, and express her opinions candidly in a daily syndicated newspaper column called My Day. She promoted labor and women's rights. In many areas, she advocated issues that her husband dared not, lest he lose support of his programs. Marian Anderson, the African-American woman you see pictured with Mrs. Roosevelt in the right-hand corner, was going to do a concert performance. But being an African-American opera singer, the Daughters of the American Revolution had her barred from singing in Washington, D.C.'s Constitution Hall because she was black. This angered the First Lady, and she helped hold the concert at Lincoln Memorial on federal property on Easter Sunday, April 9th, 1939. The performance was attended by 75,000 people. This and many other things made her a tempting target for political enemies, but her integrity, her graciousness, and her sincerity of purpose endeared her personality to many, from heads of state to servicemen. She visited abroad during World War II. She had written wistfully at 14, "No matter how plain a woman may be, if truth and loyalty are stamped upon her face, all will be attracted to her." New Deal under fire and continuing hardships. The New Deal did not end the Great Depression. By 1939, over 17% of the labor force was still unemployed. The New Deal did not extend to immigrants. Many Americans viewed immigrants as competition for jobs and a threat to the U.S. economy. Nativism increased during this economic downturn, much as it had during the past economic struggles. The Democratic Party was divided on its view of immigration during the Great Depression, making FDR hesitant to pursue legislation that would have protected immigrants. FDR's New Deal failed to address long-standing patterns of racism and segregation in the South. He feared that to do so would alienate his Southern supporters in Congress, and the New Deal would crumble. FDR refused to support anti-lynching legislation and end the poll tax. African Americans were discriminated from a number of New Deal agencies, TVA, CCC, and FHA. The requirements of the Agricultural Adjustment Act to plow under lands affected African American tenant farmers the worst, as their lands were the first that the farmers would allow to go fallow. During the turbulence in Mexico in the 1910s, many thousands of Mexicans had immigrated north and were now denied access to government programs because of their lack of citizenship. Many states deported illegal immigrants. Court cases and civil liberties. An all-white jury in Alabama on flimsy and conflicting testimony convicted 9 black boys and men ages 13 to 21 of raping 2 white women while riding a freight train. 8 were sentenced to death, and turned out the 2 women were actually prostitutes. In Powell versus Alabama, the Supreme Court overturned the conviction based on that the judge had not ensured that the accused were provided with adequate defense. In Norris v. Alabama, systematic exclusion of African Americans from Alabama juries had denied the Scottsboro defendants equal protection under law. During the New Deal, African Americans gained legal victories in the Supreme Court concerning their civil rights, although they would not be all-encompassing, and they would set the foundation for future legislation in the 1950s and the 1960s. Native Americans and the Depression. The so-called Indian New Deal, officially known as the Indian Reorganization Act, did not achieve all its objectives outlined by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA. Commissioner John Collier. Despite its problems, the law encouraged several tribes to give suffrage and the right to hold office to women. Collier made important strides by ensuring that all Indians were given access to New Deal programs and by hiring them within the BIA.
Women in the New Deal. Relief programs produced mixed results for women. Men's programs were stressed and women received less relief and lower pay. WPA programs emphasized traditional ideas for women's work. The NRA and Social Security Act also discriminated against women. Women did gain political influence as they helped develop and implement New Deal social legislation. Women also served as high levels in Roosevelt's administration. Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins was the first woman cabinet member in U.S. history. Cultural life during the Depression. As much as populism of the Gilded Age and the rampant consumerism of the Roaring Twenties affected the writers of their eras, so did the hardships of the 30s. John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath illustrated the journey of displaced Oklahomians fleeing the Dust Bowl, specifically the Joad family, where the matriarch of the family, Ma Joad, explains, "They cannot wipe us out, and they cannot lick us." The solidarity of struggling people was the theme of the Depression, according to Steinbeck. Richard Wright's masterpiece Native Son focused on the forgotten Americans at the bottom of the heap. The story of 20-year-old Bigger Thomas, a pool shark and petty thief, and enslaved in Chicago's ghetto by the virtue of his birth. He fears and envies whites, and that something bad will happen to him. It does, an accidental murder and its cover-up, leading to more heinous crimes, all which, according to Wright, resulted from racism in America's society. At Bigger's murder trial, his attorney, Mr. Max, pleads for African Americans in general. Popular culture, radio and movies. The golden age of the motion picture and radio industry. By the time of the Great Depression, over 10 million families had a radio, which came to be the focus for family gatherings and news dissemination. FDR used this as his advantage in his fireside chats, in which he would regularly broadcast his ideas for the New Deal to garner popular support for the programs. By the late 1920s, silent movies gave way to those with sound, and many made during this time avoid the harshness of people's lives. 65% of the population attended movies per week. Comedies like It Happened One Night and musicals Flying Down to Rio with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. The Wizard of Oz with Judy Garland, Jack Haley, Ray Bolger, and Burt Lahr. Love stories and gangster films were the favorite of the movie fans. Hollywood stars included Greta Garbo, Marlene Dietrich, Clark Gable, and James Cagney. Horror movies such as Dracula, Frankenstein, and King Kong. Most popular film in 1939 was Gone with the Wind, a drama about the South during the Civil War and Reconstruction. Escapist slapstick comedies like the Marx Brothers, Chico, Groucho, Harpo, and Zeppo in The Night of the Opera, Animal Crackers, Coconuts, and Duck Soup. As an example of Groucho Marx, I once shot an elephant in my pajamas. How I ever got in my pajamas, I will never know. Critics. When it became apparent that the New Deal was unable to completely defeat the Great Depression, criticism of FDR's plans began to emerge. Conservatives believe FDR had gone too far left and was leading the country down a socialist path. Liberals criticized FDR for going too far right when it was only there to help the financial industry. Dr. Francis Townsend called for payments of $200 a month to persons over 60 years of age to be paid for by a 2% tax on all commercial transactions. Each recipient would have to spend it all within the month. By 1935, they claimed 5 million backers, illustrating a desire for a kind of old age pension. The plan itself would have cost more than half the nation's income and only help 9% of the population. Father Charles Townsend claimed almost 40 million listeners. At first, an enthusiastic supporter of the New Deal, but by 1934 he voiced the opinion that FDR was not going far enough. He was specific in calling for silver inflation, but was extremely vague on other issues, offering no real solutions. His broadcast attacked international bankers, a code word for Jews, communists, labor unions, and Roosevelt's administration as unemployment remained high. By 1937, however, he increasingly voiced anti-Semitic and pro-fascist views, which lost him his relevancy in a huge audience. His superiors finally silenced him in 1942. Senator Huey Long from Louisiana sought the limelight to attack FDR and their own plans. Known in Louisiana as the Kingfish, Long's Share the Wealth program demanded that the government make every man a king and guaranteeing every family an annual income of $2,000 and a homestead or $6,000 to build a home. To pay for all this, the government would nationalize all banks and allow no one to be over 10 millionaire. Share Our Wealth clubs sprang up all around the country, especially in the South, supporting the concept. In August of 1935, Long announced his intentions to run for president, and if not as a Democratic nominee, then as a third-party candidate. Roosevelt was certain that such a candidacy would pull votes from his campaign for re-election in 1936. On September 8, 1935, Long was shot to death at the Capitol building in Baton Rouge, dying of internal bleeding on September 10th. His alleged assailant, Dr. Carl Austin Weiss, Jr., whose father-in-law had been ruined by Long, was immediately killed by Long's bodyguards. The Supreme Court. Many of FDR's New Deal programs found themselves outside constitutional authority, and some, like the National Industrial Recovery Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, were struck down by the Supreme Court. In Schechter Poultry Corporation versus the United States, the National Industrial Recovery Act were killed for its violation of the Constitution, stating Congress had given the president too much authority by creating codes of fair competition that violated antitrust laws. Also, Congress had no control over the intrastate commerce of the Schechter Company, which only operated in New York State. In United States v. Butler, the processor's tax on the middlemen who process the food crops and warehouse commodities like cotton, and the AAA itself funded by the tax, was struck down as being unconstitutional. FDR found the greatest problem in fulfilling his plans to end the Great Depression in an unexpected area, the judicial branch of the federal government. The Second New Deal, 1935 through 1938, the Works Projects Administration. FDR's Second New Deal addressed labor and unemployment issues. The $4.8 billion Emergency Relief Appropriation Act was the largest peacetime spending bill in American history when it passed. A new agency created under Harry Hopkins again, the Work Projects Administration, the WPA, replaced the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which had concentrated on improving the nation's infrastructure. The WPA, which became the nation's largest employer, aided around 9 million people in the period 1935 to 1943. The National Youth Administration, part of the WPA, focused on students and youth seeking to provide part-time jobs to students and youth without jobs. Both Lyndon Baines Johnson and Richard Milhous Nixon, future presidents from two parties, benefited from the NYA's programs. The Wagner Act, known as the National Labor Relations Act, prohibited employers from interfering with union activities and allowed workers to bargain through unions of their own choice. It set up the National Labor Relations Board to hear unfair labor practices. The Social Security Act of 1935 allowed a stipend to be given to the aged, disabled, or unemployed and paid by a payroll tax from employers. The Revenue Act of 1935 increased the surtax rate on individual incomes over $50,000, the estate tax on individual estates over $40,000, and graduated steeply taxes on individual incomes over $1 million until the rate was 75% and access of $5 million. Decreased the small corporation tax rate to 12% while increasing the corporate tax on incomes above $15,000 to 15%. Some excess profits over 10% were taxed at a 6% rate and an excess of 15% at a 12% rate. This angered business leaders and many other wealthy members of society who feared FDR was leading the nation down the path of socialism. And then the real fact is they would refuse to reinvest in the economy. This further delayed the recovery of the Great Depression. The NIRA's requirement that every worker had the right to join a union was quickly picked up by unions and translated by opportunistic union leaders as the president wants you to join the union. As a result, union membership during the New Deal exploded. Militant laborers challenged traditional labor leaders by forming the Congress of Industrial Organization. In 1937, the Congress of Industrial Organization was formed as a separate group and won major victories in the auto and steel industries. Auto workers at GM's Flint, Michigan plant won their strike by using a unique tactic of sit-down. They refused to move from their workstation. Although this violated state and federal laws on trespassing, neither the Democratic governor or FDR would intervene. The struggles were bitter and at times violent, including the Memorial Day Massacre in 1937 when police fired on strikers and their families, killing 10 people. Roosevelt's second term, the election of 1936. Roosevelt was nominated by the Democrats for a second term in 1936. The 1936 election supplied Americans with the opportunity to vote on FDR and the New Deal. The Republicans nominated the governor of Kansas, Alfred Landon. The New Deal created a strong coalition of white Southerners, Western farmers, labor, union members, urban ethnic groups, and women. Republicans conducted a telephone poll during the campaign and found out a majority supported Landon over FDR. It will be a Landon slide, claimed the Republicans. Eleanor Roosevelt attracted as much support from women for her husband. When the first returns came in, Landon won Maine and Vermont. And Republicans would say, as goes Maine and Vermont, goes the rest of the country. FDR would take the next 46 states. It was a huge landslide. And for the first time, African Americans came out in droves to support the Democratic nominee. Challenging the court. Believing he had won a mandate for his agenda, FDR turned his attention to the greatest hindrance of his plan, the Supreme Court. He introduced a plan to increase the size of the Supreme Court from 9 to 15 members, along with 50 more federal judges. This would allow him to appoint these new judges and, as he hoped, counteract the anti-New Deal feelings of his existing court. However, his plan backfired. It was criticized by both the press and members in the Congress. Of all the branches, the United States government, the Supreme Court was at the time the most highly honored, and his attempts to challenge their makeup to his favor portrayed him as petty and dictatorial. Although he lost the battle, subsequent cases supporting the New Deal legislation, FDR commented that he had won the overall war. A slumping economy. Almost after 10 years of depression and almost 4 years of the New Deal, the economy began to show signs of recovery. To control inflation, FDR ordered cuts in government spending to wean the American people off federal pay. However, the opposite from what FDR intended to happen occurred when the stock market entered a slump and a sharp recession occurred in 1937 that led to increasing spending. 4 million more people found themselves unemployed. The recession strengthened the New Deal opponents and the conservative congressional leadership to block most new reforms. The National Housing Act, creating the U.S. Housing Authority to administer low-interest 60-year loans to small communities for slum clearance and the construction projects, and to great subsidies for sending rent year to low-income individuals in areas where local agencies provided 25% of the federal grant. The Farm Tenant Act provided loans to farmers to keep them from losing their land to bankruptcy, loans to tenant farmers so they can purchase their own farms. The Fair Labor Standards or Wages and Hour Act, businesses engaged in interstate commerce, with some exceptions, were required to pay a minimum wage of 40 cents per hour, up from 25 cents an hour. The legacy of the New Deal. FDR's decision to court Northern Union members and African Americans to win the presidency split the Democratic Party. Southern Democrats were unwilling to congregate with them and feared that FDR's ultimate goal was to make them all equal. Plans to also organize the executive branch along with the Democratic Party itself resulted in the victory of Republicans in the midterm elections of 1938. Republicans gained in Congress for the first time since 1928 with 7 seats, 23 to 69, 4 to the others, and 70 House seats, 164 to 261, 4 to others. FDR would, for the last of his second term, find himself defending the existing legislation in lieu of introducing new laws. The Second New Deal ended just as the war was erupting in Europe. The New Deal shifted the way people thought about government. Gone was the populist approach of using government to regulate business to the benefit of all. Now, government was seen as an entity to respond directly to the crisis and take steps to avoid them. The New Deal had reached its ideological limits in 1938, and Congress had grown conservative as many Democrats abandoned their enthusiasm for FDR's ideas after the court packing incident. FDR's administration did expand the power of the federal government. The president took a more active role in shaping the economy, creating federal jobs and settling labor disputes. It created the FDIC, SEC to regulate banking and securities. Did not end the Great Depression, but eased its suffering. The deficit reached $5 billion. World War II would ultimately end the Great Depression.